Kenneth Harris set the wrench down on the hood of $1 million car and said completely calmly, "Your carburetor's misaligned." The lead technician, 11 years on the floor, arms crossed, jaw set, stared at him. "We've had this car for 3 weeks. 6 of my best people couldn't find it, I know." Kenneth wiped his hands. "Took me 90 minutes. The room went silent, not the polite kind. The kind where 12 people stop pretending they aren't watching. And then the technician said quietly, the way people say things when they're recalculating someone they already decided didn't belong." "Where did she find you?" Kenneth looked at him. Didn't raise his voice, didn't smile. "Side of the road," he said, fixing her car. "While 6 of your best people were in here not finding the problem, he picked up the wrench. Went back to work because here's what nobody in that room knew yet: the woman who hired him wasn't just his boss. And the man trying to push him out wasn't just threatened by his talent. He was being paid to be." Kenneth Harris locked up the garage at 6:30 on a Friday evening in August, and the heat hit him the second he stepped outside. Not warm, not uncomfortable. The kind of heat that made the air feel solid. Like the city of Charlotte had decided to press down on everything and everyone underneath it and just hold. He wiped his hands on a rag that had been white maybe 3 years ago, ran it across his forehead, looked at the smear of grease it left behind, and decided that was a problem for later. Later. Everything was a problem for later with Kenneth Harris. The garage sat on the outskirts of the city, far enough from downtown that the skyline was just a suggestion in the distance. A cluster of glass and steel that belonged to a different world entirely. Kenneth's world was this: 2 hydraulic lifts, a part shelf that leaned slightly to the left, a mini fridge that kept drinks at exactly the wrong temperature, and the smell of motor oil so deep in the walls that he suspected it had become structural at this point. If someone tore the place down, the oil would stay standing. He had worked here for 6 years. Before that, 2 years at a community college studying mechanical engineering. Before that, a kid from Concord who could name every engine configuration Ford had ever produced and did not yet know how fast a life could change. He grabbed his keys, checked his phone. 2 messages from his mother, Dorothy, which meant Elliot was fine. Dorothy only texted when things were fine. When things were not fine, she called. Twice, in a row, without leaving a voicemail. He had learned to read the difference a long time ago, and the education had not been comfortable. The drive to Dorothy's house took 14 minutes on a good day. Today was not a good day for the roads, but it was a manageable one. Kenneth pulled onto the highway and joined the slow crawl of people trying to get somewhere else. He let his mind go quiet. That was the thing about driving: it was the only time his brain actually powered down. Not sleep. Sleep was complicated these days, had been for 4 years. But driving was different. Driving was just movement. Forward, 1 mile and then another. Claire had always laughed at that. She said he was the only person she knew who used a commute as meditation. She wasn't wrong. He did not let himself stay on that thought too long. He had learned that too. Not to push the thought away that never worked, but to let it move through like weather. Acknowledge it, let it pass. Keep driving. 4 years. Elliot was 5 when it happened. He was 9 now. And he had his mother's habit of asking questions that made adults pause before answering. And he had Kenneth's eyes. And he had somehow become the most specific kind of stubborn that you could only get from inheriting it from both parents simultaneously. Kenneth loved that kid more than he had words for, which was fine. He was not a man built for many words. He was built for getting things done. He was about 2 miles from Dorothy's neighborhood when he saw the Mustang. It was pulled off to the right shoulder, hood up, midnight blue paint catching what was left of the afternoon sun and throwing it back in a way that made other cars look like they were apologizing for existing. A 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback. Kenneth's foot came off the gas before he even made a conscious decision. Because that was not a car you drove past. That was not a car you filed away as someone else's problem and kept moving. A 67 Fastback was a living document of everything Detroit had understood about itself at its absolute best: balanced, intentional, built with the kind of confidence that did not need to shout. He pulled off behind it, put the truck in park, sat there for exactly 1 second. Then he got out. The woman standing beside the car was not what he expected. He was not sure what he expected. Someone flustered. Maybe someone already on the phone, someone performing distress for the benefit of passing traffic. What he got was none of that. She was standing with her right hand on her hip and her left hand holding a phone that she was not using. Not calling anyone, not texting. Just holding it, the way people hold something when they need their hands occupied while their brain works through a problem. She was looking at the engine like it owed her an explanation. Tall. Maybe 5'8". Talk no hot dare, the kind that picked up gold in direct light falling straight and clean past her shoulders. Gray eyes, not soft gray, the gray of overcast sky right before it decides what it's going to do. A cream-colored silk blouse that had somehow survived the August heat without looking defeated. Slate gray trousers, cut precisely. Oxford shoes, brown leather, low-heeled and serious. She looked like someone who had a 7 o'clock somewhere important. And she looked completely unbothered by the fact that she wasn't going to make it. Not helpless, not panicked, just annoyed. The specific annoyance of someone whose schedule had just been edited without permission. She turned at the sound of his footsteps on the gravel shoulder. Kenneth kept his voice even. Need a hand? She pulled her sunglasses off. The gray eyes assessed him with the same focused attention she'd been giving the engine. Quick, professional, like she was running a diagnosis. Are you a mechanic? Not a question. An identification, something like that? Then yes, she stepped aside. Made room at the hood. It started stuttering about 3 miles back. Died completely before I could get off the highway properly. He stepped up to the engine, leaned in, ran his eyes across the bay, methodically battery terminals, belts, vacuum lines. The car was immaculate in there. Not just clean, loved. Someone had taken serious care of this machine, which meant neglect wasn't the issue. He followed the fuel line with 2 fingers, found it, a loose fuel line coupling, slight lip separated, and beneath it, the fuel pump showing early signs of fatigue, still functional, but working harder than it should. You've got a loose coupling on the fuel line, he said, and your fuel pump is starting to wear. I can fix the coupling right here. The pump needs a proper replacement in the next week. Maybe 2, how long for the coupling? 15 minutes, she put her sunglasses back on, crossed her arms. Then please? He worked in silence for a while, not uncomfortable silence. Just the silence of someone doing a thing they know how to do. He tightened the coupling, checked the surrounding connections, tested the pressure by hand. She didn't hover with nervous energy the way some people did when a mechanic touches their car. She just stood slightly back, arms crossed, looking out at the passing traffic with the patient stillness of someone who had learned to wait without wasting the time. He found himself curious about that. You from around here? He wasn't even sure why he asked. Filling the quiet, maybe. She took a half beat before answering. Not exactly. Passing through, that's a shame. He glanced up at the car and meant it. Not many people in this part of Charlotte driving a car like this. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, exactly, more like interest. The way a person looks when someone says something they didn't expect. You know the car, she said? It's a 67 Fastback. Yeah. I know the car. Most people just see an old Mustang. Most people aren't looking right. He straightened, wiped his hands. Try it. She slid into the driver's seat with the ease of someone who had been doing it for years, turned the key. The engine caught immediately that deep, authoritative rumble that a properly running V8 produces, the kind that you feel in your sternum before you hear it with your ears. She sat with it for a moment, just listening. Then she got out. What do I owe you? Nothing. A pause. She removed her sunglasses again. Those gray eyes were doing the assessment thing again. It took you time, and you used your tools. It took me 15 minutes and 2 wrenches. I'm not going to charge you for that. She studied him with the expression of someone encountering a variable their model hadn't accounted for. Then she put her wallet back in her bag. All right, thank you. Then, genuinely, drive safe. He picked up his toolbox. Get that fuel pump looked at before it becomes a bigger conversation. I will. She was already moving back to the driver's side. I'm Sandra, by the way, Kenneth, she nodded once. Like she was filing it away. Then she pulled the door shut, eased back onto the highway, and was gone. He stood there for a moment, watched the midnight blue fade into traffic. There was something about her that didn't add up in a way he couldn't quite name. Not suspicious, just incomplete. Like a car that runs fine but has one gauge sitting slightly off-center. Everything's working. But something knows something you don't yet. He got back in his truck and kept driving to Dorothy's. Dorothy Harris answered the door before he could knock, which was not unusual. Dorothy operated on a timeline slightly ahead of everyone else's, and she found it personally offensive when people made her wait on her own porch. "You're 4 minutes late?" she said. Traffic. There's always traffic. That's why you leave earlier. She stepped it aside to let him in. 63 years old, white hair cut short and no nonsense, with a posture that suggested she had decided decades ago to be exactly the height she was and stop negotiating about it. Elliot, it's in the kitchen. He ate, don't worry. He had strong opinions about the pasta. He always has strong opinions about pasta. He told me I overcooked it, did you? Dorothy gave him a look that was its own complete answer. Elliot was indeed in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a glass of orange juice and a drawing he was working on. 9 years old and already with the focused expression of someone who did not appreciate interruptions mid-project. He had Claire's hands, long fingers, good for detail work. He had Kenneth's tendency to go very still when he was concentrating. Hey, buddy. Elliot looked up. Bo, you're late. I helped someone with a car on the way. That changed the energy immediately. Elliot set down his pencil. What kind of car? 67 Mustang Fastback. Elliot's eyes went wide in the specific way that 9-year-olds reserve for things that genuinely matter to them. The real kind? Not a restoration project? Already restored, running beautiful. Just had a fuel line issue. What color? Midnight blue. Elliot turned this information over with the seriousness it deserved. That's the second best color for that car. What's the first? Dark green. Obviously, he picked up his pencil again. Was it a girl or a boy driving it? Dorothy, from the doorway, made a quiet sound that was not quite a laugh. A woman, Kenneth said. Why? Because Grandma says you never talk to anyone. Elliot said this with the complete casualness of someone reporting a weather condition. So I'm just doing when you do. Kenneth looked at his mother. Dorothy was studying the ceiling with great interest. Thanks, Mom. I didn't say a word, Dorothy said. And technically that was true. He got Elliot's bag, said his goodbyes, and drove his son home through the darkening Charlotte evening. They talked about the Mustang for most of it. Elliot had genuine opinions about the 67 versus the 68 body styling opinions Kenneth had inadvertently ceded by letting the spend too much time in the garages on weekends. He was not sorry about that. There were worse things to understand deeply. At home he made sandwiches because it was Friday, and Fridays were sandwiches, and neither of them had ever wanted to change this. Elliot ate and talked and drew more things, and eventually fell asleep on the couch in the middle of asking a question about whether a car could technically be considered a living thing if it had a heartbeat rhythm in its engine. Kenneth carried him to bed, stood in the doorway for a moment. 4 years, and still on certain nights the quiet of the house after Elliot fell asleep pressed against him in a way that required conscious management. He turned off the light, went to the kitchen, made coffee he would not finish, stood at the counter and thought about a midnight blue Mustang disappearing into traffic and a woman with gray eyes who filed his name away like she would need it later. Probably nothing. He drank half the coffee, poured the rest out, went to bed. 1 week later, a number he did not recognize called at 11 in the morning while he was elbow deep in the differential of a 98 F-150. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then something instinct, or the particular way idle curiosity works on a slow morning, made him wipe his hand and answer. Kenneth Harris, not a question. A professional voice, female, measured. This is Margaret Scott. I'm calling on behalf of Lee Automotive Group. He straightened slowly. Okay, we're expanding our classic restoration division and we're looking to fill a senior position. Head of classic restoration, it would mean overseeing a team, managing projects from intake to delivery, and working directly with some of the most significant vehicles in private collections on the East Coast. A brief pause. Your name came up as a recommendation. Kenneth stared at the far wall of the garage. There was a snap-on calendar from 3 years ago still hanging there because he kept forgetting to take it down. He looked at it now like it might provide context. I think you might have the wrong person. We don't, calm. Not defensive. Your work has a strong reputation in the restoration community here in Charlotte. We've done our research. I work at a garage in the suburbs. Yes, we know, a half-beat. That's not disqualifying, Mr. Harris. In fact, it's part of why your name came up. He ran the back of his wrist across his forehead. Who recommended me, specifically? A slight pause. Not evasive, measured. That's not something I'm able to share at this stage. The salary. 6 figures. Full benefits. You'd be working with equipment that most restoration professionals never get access to. He said nothing for a moment. The F-150's differential sat waiting patiently. When's the interview? We're flexible. Could be as early as Monday. If that works for you, I'll call you back by end of day. He took down the number she gave him, hung up, stood very still. Then he walked to the other bay where George White was arguing with an air compressor that had been disagreeing with him all morning, and said, "Did you send my name somewhere?" George looked up. "What, my name? Did you put it anywhere? Recommendation, referral, anything?" George gave him the look of someone who had been friends with Kenneth long enough to know when he was asking something that mattered. "Man, when have you ever had a CV? Where would I even send it?" "That's what I thought." George straightened, wiped his hands. "Why? What happened?" "Some company called Lee Automotive just offered me a job interview." George stared at him. Lee Automotive, as in the Lee Automotive Group. The one with the facility off Moorhead, apparently. George was quiet for 2 full seconds, which was long for George. "Did you win the lottery recently and not tell me?" "I'm going to call them back and say yes." "Obviously you're going to say yes." George pointed at him with a grease-stained finger. "You're going to say yes, and then you're going to figure out the rest later. Because that is not a call you turn down." Kenneth was already walking back to his phone, Monday morning. Kenneth wore the best version of what he owned, a clean button-down in dark navy, jeans without visible damage, and boots that had been properly maintained. He looked like himself, which was the point. He was not to become a different person to walk through a glass door. Lay Automotive Group's Charlotte facility was not what he'd pictured. He had pictured a corporate tower. Something deliberately intimidating with a lobby that existed specifically to make you feel small before you got to the elevator. What he found instead was a building that looked like someone had taken a serious industrial workspace and applied significant money to it, not to make it fancy, but to make it exactly correct. Steel and glass, yes, clean lines. But the moment you stepped through the entrance, there was the smell, motor oil, carbon, the specific warmth of a space where engines ran. It smelled like a garage that had gotten its life together. Margaret Scott met him in the lobby, 55, white hair cut short and clean suit jacket over a plain blouse. She shook his hand with the efficiency of someone who had processed a great many first impressions and was done performing warmth she didn't feel. "Mr. Harris, thank you for coming." She walked and talked simultaneously, which he appreciated. "I'll give you a brief tour of the floor before we go up." The restoration floor was something else entirely. He had worked in garages his whole adult life. He thought he understood what a serious workspace looked like. He did not, as it turned out, have the full picture. The vehicles in this space were the kind of cars that lived in museums and private collections, and occasionally sold at auction for amounts that seemed fictional. They were at various stages of restoration, some stripped to the frame, some in final finishing stages, some looking so close to factory condition that his brain briefly refused to accept they were 90-year-old machines. The people working on them moved with the particular focus of people who took their work personally. And then he saw the woman standing on the far side of the floor, navy suit, tailored close, hair back, the gray eyes already on him before he'd fully registered she was there. Sandra. Not Sandra from the side of the road, blouse and Oxford shoes and a broken Mustang. Sandra in her actual context. In the building where she apparently ran things, he stopped walking. She crossed the floor toward him without rushing, stopped at a comfortable distance. "You came?" He held very still. "You set this up?" I did." "Why?" She didn't answer immediately. "Not evasion consideration. Because you knew what was wrong with my car before I finished explaining the symptoms. Because you refused payment for 15 minutes of work, which meant you weren't thinking about the transaction. And because the best restoration director I had in that position before left for a corporate competitor, and I've been looking for someone who understands cars as objects worth caring about rather than assets worth flipping." A pause. "You fit the criteria." Something pressed against the inside of his chest. Not quite gratitude, not quite irritation, something located precisely between the two. "That feels a lot like charity." She didn't flinch. "I know what charity looks like. This isn't that. You don't know anything about me. I know you've been running a 2-bay suburban garage for 6 years, when your skill level is 4 rungs above that. I know you've built a reputation in the restoration community you probably don't even fully realize you have. And I know that when someone offers you money for work that took 15 minutes, you say no." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm offering you what your work is actually worth." The floor was quiet around them. A few of the technicians had glanced over. looked away, doing the thing professionals do when they're pretending not to pay attention. He looked at her, looked at the room, looked at a 1954 Mercedes-Benz 300 LS gullwing on the lift to his left that was in the middle of a restoration so precise it made his hands itch. "Tell me about the position," he said. Margaret Scott appeared at his elbow with a folder. He suspected she had been waiting for exactly this moment. They went upstairs. The office was clean and functional, with windows overlooking the floor below. A conference room, a table that could fit 12 but was currently occupied by 3 people, him, Margaret, and Sandra Lee, who sat across from him and explained, with a directness he had not expected, but found he was grateful for, exactly what the job was. He would lead the restoration division. He would have a team of 7 technicians, with authority to hire or restructure as needed. He would have creative and technical control over project approach, with the expectation of transparency about timeline and methodology. He would report directly to the head of operations. "Who's the head of operations?" he said. "Me," Sandra said. He nodded slowly. "And the CEO?" A fraction of a pause. "Not guilt. Something more complicated than that. My brother Stephen. He handles external relationships and investor-facing responsibilities. And you handle everything else. And I handle everything else," she confirmed, evenly. No editorializing. He took the folder from Margaret, read through it. The numbers were real, the benefits were real, the equipment list was real. Every page of it was a version of the work he already knew how to do, at a scale he had not yet had access to. He thought about Elliot, about tuition costs and the increasingly narrow margin between what he earned and what things cost. About the specific future he wanted his son to have access to. "I need to think about it," he said. Of course, Sandra didn't push. "Take a few days." He drove home, sat at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of him while Elliot did homework at the other end. The numbers blurred a little. Not because they were confusing, because he kept looking at them and then looking at his kid and running the same calculation over and over. Finally, Elliot said, without looking up, "Is this about the Mustang lady?" Kenneth blinked. "Sort of. What does she want?" "She wants me to come work for her company." Elliot turned this over. Tilted his head the way he did when he was taking something seriously. "Is it a good job?" "On paper, it's a great job. What's the problem then?" "I don't like being someone's project." Elliot down his pencil. He had Claire's habit of making full eye contact when he was about to say something he'd actually thought through. "Bo, you always tell me that the only way to find out if something is real is to try it." A pause. "You say that a lot, actually. Like a lot. Kenneth looked at his 9-year-old son across the kitchen table. "That tracks," he said finally. "So?" Elliot picked the pencil back up. "Try it." 2 days later, Kenneth walked back into Leo Automotive with a signed contract in his jacket pocket. Margaret Scott met him downstairs. Sandra was already in her office. He set the contract on her desk. She looked at it, then at him. That slight shift at the corner of her mouth that was the most unbothered version of satisfaction he had ever seen on a person. "Good, I want to be clear about something," he held her gaze. "I'm doing this because it's the right next step for my son and for my work. Not because someone is doing me a favor." She held his gaze right back. "If it turns out to be charity in disguise, I'll leave." "It won't be." He nodded once. "Then we understand each other." He was not entirely sure they did yet, but it was a start. The first morning on the restoration floor looked different when you were responsible for it. Kenneth stood at the entrance for a moment, just long enough to take it in properly. 11 active projects. 6 in various stages of disassembly and assessment. 3 in restoration, 2 in vehicles. Extraordinary: a 32 Ford Roadster, a 57 Chevy Bel Air, a 63 Jaguar E-Type, a Duesenberg Model J from 1931 that sat under a protective cover at the far end of the floor with the quiet authority of a thing that knew exactly what it was. Then he walked in. The reaction was immediate and varied. 3 of the junior technicians looked up and did the neutral nod of people reserving judgment. 2 older ones looked away with the pointed deliberateness of people who had already formed an opinion. One of them, Brian Taylor, 25, the workshop's apparent question-asker, nearly walked into a tool cart because he was looking at Kenneth instead of where he was going. And then there was Edward Harris, no relation. Kenneth would have to get used to that, the brief moment in every conversation where someone registered the shared last name and waited for the explanation. Edward Harris, 47, lead technician, talk muy tiu, combed back clean. jaw set in a way that suggested it was often set that way. He was standing at the workbench nearest the entrance, and he did not look up when Kenneth walked in, did not acknowledge, did not do the professional courtesy of making eye contact with the person who was now technically his direct superior. Kenneth walked over, stood within reasonable conversational distance. "Morning." Edward looked up then. The look was thorough, the look of a man running a system check. Harris, Kenneth confirmed, "I know. We can figure out a naming system later." Something moved in Edward's expression, not warmth, not hostility, something neutral and deeply skeptical. "You know your way around this floor?" "Not yet. I'll learn it." "You've worked in a two-bay garage." "I have. These aren't the same class of vehicle. Machines are machines." Kenneth kept his voice level. "Not challenging, just factual. They have the same categories of problems regardless of what cost. I'll figure out what I don't know." Edward looked at him for one more beat. Then he went back to his parts catalog. Storage rooms in the back. Tools are organized by function, not by name, which means if you're used to your own system, you'll need to adjust. We don't touch a car without signing the log. Every contact gets recorded, every adjustment, every part sourced, every conversation with the owner goes through documentation. If you bypass that once, I'll have a problem with you. Understood? Good. He turned a page. Then go find your office. Brian Taylor materialized at Kenneth's elbow approximately 30 seconds later, with the specific energy of someone who had been waiting nearby and trying to appear as though he hadn't been. "I can show you around if you want," Brian offered. "I know where everything is. Mostly. There's one cabinet in the back that nobody fully understands, but we've all kind of agreed not to open it. Show me the floor first." Brian walked him through it. He talked fast and remembered details and only knocked something over once, which he seemed to feel was a personal best. By the end of the tour, Kenneth had a working map in his head of where everything lived and what was currently in progress. And then there was the car in the corner bay. 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda. Burnt orange, or it had been once the paint was in rough shape at the finishing stage. But the car itself, the bones, the specific weight of that vehicle in that space. Kenneth stopped. Brian stopped with him. That one's the problem car." "What's the problem?" "Engine's making a sound nobody can trace. Intermittent knock, cyclic, shows up after about 10 minutes of running. 3 weeks of diagnostic work and no one's found the source. Mr. Harris, the other Mr. Harris, has been saying we may need to bring in an outside specialist." Kenneth looked at the car for a long moment. "Who's currently assigned to it?" "Technically the whole team. Practically nobody, because Mr. Harris, other Harris, told everyone to stand down until he figured out the approach." "I'll look at it this afternoon," Kenneth said. Brian's eyes went slightly wide. "Mr. Harris, the other one might. I'll handle that." The conversation with Edward came approximately 2 hours later, as Kenneth had expected it would. Edward appeared in the doorway of the small glass-walled office that overlooked the floor. He stopped there with the body language of a man who had decided to deliver a message and was not interested in being redirected. "I heard you told Taylor you were going to work on the Cuda." "I did. That car is under my assessment protocol." "I understand that. I'm not taking it from you. I just want to look at the engine." "We've all looked at the engine, I know. And you haven't found the source." Kenneth set down the clipboard he'd been holding. "If I find it, it's information for the whole team. If I don't find it, nothing changes, and I've learned something about what we've already ruled out. Either way, it's not a loss." Edward studied him. The skepticism was still there, solid, architectural. "You've worked on HEMIS before, specifically 426s, yes. 3 full restorations and a couple of rebuild assists. Also had a 69 Roadrunner in my garage for 4 months that had a similar cyclic knock issue. Took me a week to find it. What was it? Cam bearing, passenger side. Worn by about 1/4 millimeter, not enough to flag on standard diagnostic. Engine sounded clean on the scan. Had to find it by feel." Edward was quiet for a moment. Something in him recalibrated very slightly. "Log everything. You touched the engine, it's in the record." Of course, he was gone before Kenneth could say anything else. That afternoon, Kenneth spent 90 minutes with the Cuda. He did not use diagnostic equipment. He started the engine and listened. Walked around the car while it ran, crouching, pressing his palm flat against the hood, tilting his head at different angles. He was doing what he had done his whole life, using the diagnostic that lived in his own body, built out of years with machines that communicated in frequencies and rhythms if you knew how to pay attention. The knock appeared at exactly the 11-minute mark. Cyclic, passenger side. Deeper than it should be for a surface issue. He shut the engine down, got a light and went in. Cam bearing, passenger side, worn by what he estimated was with 0.3 of a millimeter. He stood up, looked around the floor. Brian Taylor was working on the Bel Air across the bay, attempting to appear as though he hadn't been monitoring the CUDA situation with the full intensity of someone watching something they cared about. Taylor. Brian looked over. Yeah, get me the bearing spec sheet for the 426 Hemi, and find Edward. Edward appeared within 3 minutes. Stood at the bay entrance. If you found something, Cam bearing passenger side, worn approximately 0.3. Not enough to flag on the scan, shows up in the rotation cycle at high idle. He held out the notation sheet. I could be wrong, but it fits the symptom pattern, exactly. Edward took the sheet. Read it again. We'll verify with a secondary assessment tomorrow. If you're right, we'll move to bearing replacement. He didn't say anything else. Just walked away with the notation sheet. Brian Taylor gave Kenneth a thumbs up from across the floor with the full conviction of a man who had completely forgotten he was supposed to be working on the Bel Air. That evening, Sandra called him into her office. Not a meeting, not a formal debrief. She was standing at the window that overlooked the floor when he knocked on the open door. Word travels, she said without turning around. The CUDA, Edward told me. Now she turned. He said you found it in 90 minutes, conditionally. Pending verification, he said he thinks you're right. She looked at him directly. Edward doesn't do generous. He does accurate. Kenneth stayed at the doorway. There's something I keep coming back to. You knew me for 15 minutes on a roadside. That's not enough to base a hire on, regardless of what you say about reputation. She was quiet for a moment, not deflecting, thinking. My grandfather built this company from a 2-bay garage in Raleigh, she said finally. Not unlike yours. He used to say that you could know a mechanic in the first 5 minutes if you watched them with a car they loved. Whether they touched it carefully, whether they listened before they acted, a pause. You came up behind my car on a Friday evening at the end of your shift. You didn't have to stop. You stopped, you listened, you found the problem, and you refused payment for it. That was 5 minutes of information. She met his eyes. I made the call, he held that. Let it settle. All right, he said, not agreement, acknowledgement. All right, she echoed. He left the office and walked back down to the floor to collect his jacket and his keys. On the way out, he passed the CUDA bay one more time, stopped for a second. The car didn't give him any answers. Cars rarely did. But there was something about standing in a building full of machines that other people had built with their hands, machines that had lasted decades because someone cared enough to make them right, that settled something in him. He drove home, picked up Elliot from Dorothy's, made sandwiches because it was Monday and Monday could be sandwich night if he decided it was. Let Elliot tell him about a disagreement he'd had at school about whether a hot dog was a sandwich, a position Elliot was prepared to defend with the full weight of his 9-year-old conviction. Later, after Elliot was in bed, Kenneth stood at the kitchen window with cold coffee and thought about the question he couldn't quite shake. Someone had called him, someone who knew his name, his reputation, his specific skill set. Margaret Scott had said his name came up as a recommendation. He hadn't asked enough questions about that. Should probably start. His phone lit up on the counter, unknown number. He picked up. The voice on the other end was male, smooth, the specific smoothness of someone who had spent years calibrating his tone for maximum effect in rooms where people were debating things. Pleasant, professional, not warm, Mr. Harris. I hope the first day went well. I'm Jeffrey Clark, a beat. I just wanted to say welcome to Lee Automotive, and I hope you find it a comfortable fit. Another beat, deliberate. For as long as you're there, the line went dead. Kenneth stood holding the phone. For as long as you're there, not a threat. Not explicitly. But the kind of sentence that was shaped exactly like a threat while containing no individual threatening word. The kind of sentence a certain type of person delivered with the full awareness that the recipient would understand exactly what it meant. He set the phone on the counter. Looked at it, Jeffrey Clark. He didn't know that name yet. He would. He finished the coffee even though it was cold, rinsed the cup, turned off the kitchen light. Whatever was happening in that building on Moorhead Street, whatever complicated visionaries existed between Sandra Lee and her brother, and whoever Jeffrey Clark was, he had walked into the middle of it without knowing it. He understood now why she had given him the job. But he was beginning to understand that the job was only part of it. He had stopped on the side of the road to fix a fuel line because that was what you did when a car needed fixing. And that was not, it turned out, where the story ended. 3 weeks in, and Kenneth Harris had developed a routine: 6:15 wake up, coffee before anything else. Elliot up by 6:40, dressed and fed and out the door by 7:20. Dropped at Dorothy's by 7:35 because Dorothy ran on her own schedule, and that schedule started at precisely 7:30 and not a second later. Then the drive to Lee Automotive, arriving by 8, floor already half alive by the time he walked through. Routine mattered, not because it was comfortable, because it was honest. A routine told you the shape of your days, and the shape of your days told you where you actually were, where he was. 3 weeks in was this. The Cuda's cam bearing had been verified replaced, and the car was running clean. Edward Harris had watched the first test drive with the expression of a man recalculating an equation he thought he'd already solved. He hadn't said much. He didn't need to. The recalculation was the thing. Brian Taylor had celebrated by buying everyone in the shop a coffee from the place 3 blocks over, and had somehow managed to get 7 different orders wrong in a way that resulted in nobody getting what they asked for, but everyone getting something they turned out to prefer. He seemed to feel this was a net positive. He explained his reasoning to Kenneth with the confidence of someone who had constructed a philosophy around an accident. Kenneth listened to the whole thing without interrupting. There was something almost admirable about it. The floor had settled into a kind of operating rhythm. Not warmth, not yet, but the friction had changed texture from the sandpaper resistance of outright skepticism to something more like the productive resistance of people deciding whether to extend trust, which was different, which was something he could work with. The technicians had started bringing him problems without being asked. Small ones: first a question about sourcing, a second opinion on a timing issue, then larger ones. It was gradual and unannounced, and he chose not to remark on it, because remarking on it would have made it self-conscious and therefore slower. And then there was Sandra. She was on the floor most days for at least part of the afternoon. She didn't hover, nothing about Sandra Lee hovered, but she was present in the building the way the building itself was present. You were aware of it without having to look directly at it. She stopped by the active bays, asked specific questions, reviewed documentation that Margaret Scott pre-sorted and brought to her in a binder she carried the way some people carry a weapon. They talked about work, always work, but the conversations had a quality to them: direct, fast. No tasted words that felt like a different kind of language running underneath the surface of the professional one. Kenneth couldn't have explained this clearly. He just knew it was there. Then Elliot came to the floor. Dorothy had a dental appointment on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks into Kenneth's tenure. He brought Elliot in for an hour rather than rearrange the entire day. He set up near his office with a book and a juice box and the firm instruction to touch nothing. Elliot touched nothing for approximately 4 minutes. Then he drifted to the floor the way 9-year-olds drift toward anything interesting, which is to say, with complete inevitability and the sincere belief that nobody had noticed. Sandra was in the finishing bay doing a walkthrough of the Bel Air's final coat inspection when Elliot appeared at her elbow. She looked down. Elliot looked up. A mutual assessment that lasted about 2 seconds, the kind that happens between people who are both direct and therefore recognize each other immediately. You own all the cars in here. Not a question. A statement delivered with the full weight of 9 years of accumulated certainty about how the world worked. Sandra considered him with the focused attention she gave everything. In a sense, yes. Elliot turned slowly, taking in the floor. The Cuda, the Duesenberg under its cover. The Jaguar E-Type that had come in 2 weeks ago and was currently down to its frame on the far lift. He turned back to her with the expression of someone doing math out loud in their head. You must be really rich. Kenneth, who had heard this from across the floor, closed his eyes briefly and considered the structural integrity of the nearest wall. Sandra didn't laugh. She tilted her head slightly, the way she did when something had genuinely caught her attention, rather than just pass through it. Why do you say that? Because old cars are expensive, and you have a lot of them. Elliot considered this further with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. Also, your shoes are really nice. Sandra looked down at her Oxfords. looked back up at the small person who had just catalogued her net worth through footwear. Your dad talks about cars the same way you do. We practice, Elliot said, completely seriously. And then Sandra Lee laughed. Not the controlled, professionally appropriate near smile that Kenneth had catalogued as her standard public expression. An actual laugh. Short, unguarded, startled out of her rather than offered. It changed her face completely. Made her look like a different version of herself, one that existed before whatever structure she'd spent years building around herself. Kenneth was across the floor, technically reviewing the Roadster's assessment log. He was not looking in Sandra's direction. He was absolutely aware of exactly what was happening in that bay. He turned a page he had not actually read and kept his eyes down. After Elliot had been returned to his book and his juice box and had negotiated for an additional 20 on the floor, looking at the Duesenberg, a negotiation Sandra had agreed to with a gravity that matched his own, the afternoon resumed its normal shape. But something had shifted in it, not dramatically, just the way a room shifts when a window opens, and the air quality changes without anyone being able to point to exactly when it happened. That evening, after Elliot had been delivered home and fed and was deeply involved in an argument with a homework problem about fractions that he felt were personally targeting him, Kenneth's phone rang. As scheduled, Mei Zhaochua, George opened with this every single call. Had for 3 weeks running. It was not going to stop, not yet. How's the fancy car place? It's not fancy, it's serious. Different thing. Sure, a pause that contained a great deal of George. How's the lady who owns the fancy car place? Kenneth moved to the kitchen, lowering his voice on instinct even though Elliot was 2 rooms away and completely absorbed in his fraction problem. She's my employer. That wasn't the question. That was my answer. George had a very specific sound for when he had an opinion he was choosing not to voice yet. He deployed it now with precision. Okay. Call me if anything happens. Nothing's going to happen. Sure, George said again, in exactly the same tone as the first sure, which was the tone of a man who had known Kenneth Harris for 15 years and had developed a detailed internal model of how he operated. He hung up. Kenneth stood in the kitchen holding his phone. Nothing was going to happen. He was there to do a job. He was doing the job. That was the full extent of it. He put the phone down and went to help Elliot with the fractions. The fractions took 40 minutes. Kenneth was not naturally a patient man, but he was a thorough one, and thorough turned out to work fine for fractions. Elliot declared the homework problem personally vindictive, and Kenneth declined to disagree, which Elliot found validating. They got through it. Week 5, a Tuesday. Stephen Lee walked onto the restoration floor for the first time since Kenneth had been there. Kenneth knew who he was before anyone said anything. Not because he'd seen a photograph he hadn't, but because certain people announced their arrival through the specific way a room adjusted around them. The subtle recalibration of bodies. The slight shift in the quality of focus. 44. Tok Vang Nat. Chai Ngook, darker at the roots than the camera-ready version would suggest. Suit grey as ash, fitted without being aggressive about it. The kind of man who had learned early that the right tailor solved more problems than most other things. Taller than Kenneth had expected, good-looking in a way that was competent rather than interesting. He moved through the floor with the ease of a man in a space he owned, which he did, on paper. He stopped at bays, asked questions. The technicians answered him with a particular brand of courtesy that was cooperative without being warm. He had the relationship with this floor that a landlord has with a good tenant. Present. Correct. Not quite belonging. He came to Kenneth's bay last. You're Harris. The confirmation again. Kenneth was getting used to people saying his name like they were checking a fact. Correct, Sandra's spoken about you. He glanced around the bay, the Plymouth Roadrunner they'd brought in last week, currently in disassembly. How are you finding it here? Good work, short. True, glad to hear it. Stephen's eyes moved with the deliberateness of someone noting things for later. You came from a single-shop background. That's a significant transition. I'm managing it, I don't doubt that. A pause that landed in a specific place. Not hostile, not friendly. Somewhere in the calibrated middle of a man who said things so that they could not be quoted against him later. Sandra's strong instincts about people. Usually, Kenneth looked at him steadily. Usually, nobody's right 100% of the time, so I'm smooth. Delivered with the particular light touch of something intended to be heard as casual and wasn't. I hope you're settling in well. That's all. He moved on. Kenneth watched him go, noted the way his shoulders sat, the tension at the jaw when he turned away. There was something wrong with Stephen Lee. Not wrong in the way of bad intentions, worn visibly wrong in the way of a man under a kind of pressure he was not sharing with anyone. The subtle wrongness of someone managing a situation they were in over their head on and could not afford to show. He thought about Jeffrey Clark's phone call. For as long as you're there. He went back to the Roadrunner's disassembly log and wrote down nothing about this, because there was nothing yet to write. That evening, Sandra stopped by his office. The hour was late enough that the floor had cleared out. The overhead lights had shifted to the reduced setting that came on automatically at 6, leaving the space in a lower, warmer register that made the cars look even more like the things they actually were, not machines exactly. Objects that had accumulated meaning over decades of being cared for. Your brother was on the floor today, Kenneth said when she appeared in the doorway. Sandra, who had been about to lead with something else, redirected without visible effort. I know. He told me. What did he tell you? That you were focused? Professional? That he thought my instincts about people were usually right? She crossed her arms. Which means he was measuring you. That's what I thought. Kenneth set down the pen. He's under pressure about something. She was quiet for a beat. What makes you say that? His jaw. The way he moved through the floor. He was seeing things, but he wasn't looking at them, he was looking past them. The cars weren't the point of the visit. He watched her face. You already knew this. Sandra moved to the window that overlooked the dark floor, the Duesenberg under its cover, the Roadrunner in pieces on the far left. Stephen has been meeting with someone for the past 2 months. I don't have all the details. What I have is a pattern changes in his calendar, the way he handles certain calls, a couple of irregularities in the reporting that could be explained 3 different ways, and only 2 of them are innocent. She turned. I've been trying to determine which explanation it is before I move. What's the non-innocent explanation? Someone is trying to use Stephen to access the company in a way I haven't authorized. A pause. Someone with enough resources to make it attractive for him. And Stephen. My brother's this company, the way someone loves a family photograph. It matters to him because of what it represents. But he's never loved what actually makes it work, the floor, the work, the decades of technical knowledge built into this team. She said this without cruelty, just clarity. That makes him a target for people who understand that gap. Kenneth thought about the phone call again, the voice that had been calibrated to sound friendly while delivering the opposite of friendliness. Jeffrey Clark. He said the air in the room changed. Sandra looked at him with an expression that was very still. He called you, night of my first day. What did he say? Welcome to Lee or Automotive. He hoped I'd find it comfortable for as long as I was there. He held her gaze. The way my son says something like that when they want you to understand there's a clock running. She turned away. Her hands were flat on the window frame, not gripping, just resting, maintaining contact with something solid. Jeffrey Clark was a federal financial advisor before he moved to private consulting, she said. He's built a portfolio of quiet influence in industries that have strong family-held assets and complicated succession structures. He finds the pressure point in a family. He applies exactly the right amount of pressure. And then he acquires what he wanted. And the pressure point here is Stephen. Stephen isn't malicious, she said. He's afraid. He's been afraid for years, afraid that the company will outlive its current structure, that the market will shift, that he'll be left holding a name that means nothing. Jeffrey Clark told him he had a solution. Her jaw tightened. The solution involves Stephen selling him enough of a stake to restructure governance. Kenneth processed this, which would put Clark in a position to remove you, which would put Clark in a position to do whatever he wanted with the company my grandfather built in a 2P garage in Raleigh. She said it evenly. The evenness was its own kind of weight. The floor stretched out below them, silent now, the Duesenberg under its cover, the Roadrunner in pieces, the Cuda in the far bay, engine running clean now, its problem found and repaid by hands that knew how to listen for it. What's on the USB, he said. She turned. Fast. What? You said you've been trying to determine which explanation covers the irregularities in the reporting. That means you have documentation. You've been building something. He kept his voice steady. What's on it? A long moment. Long enough that he thought she might redirect. Then, bank records, correspondence, transfers through an intermediary holding company. enough to show that the transaction Stephen is being moved toward has elements of securities manipulation. She paused. Margaret found it. She's been with this company for 18 years and she understands its financial architecture better than anyone alive. She flagged the irregularities 6 weeks ago, and we've been gathering material since. Why haven't you used it? The answer came slowly. Not evasive, heavy, the weight of something she had been carrying for a while and had not yet set down. Because using it means going to a regulatory body with evidence that implicates my brother in a transaction he may not fully understand. And once that filing happens, the story writes itself in a way that I can't control. She looked at him. Stephen isn't the enemy here, he's being used by one, and I keep thinking there has to be a way to extract him from this without burning him in the process. Kenneth stood up, walked to the window beside her, not close, just close enough to stand in the same section of the room, looking at the same floor. He may not let you, Kenneth said. Extract him, I mean. Some people don't know how to be saved without first finishing what they started. Something in her face, a fractional controlled release, like a joint in a structure absorbing load the way it was designed to. Not collapse, just adjustment, the kind that lets the building stand. When did you get good at this? She said. Not quite a question. I suppose assuming everything alone, he said. You get good at reading situations or you get buried by them. She nodded. Looked back at the floor. I'm not ready to use it yet. But I want you to know it exists. Why tell me? Because Jeffrey Clark called you on your first night here. Which means you're already in this whether you chose to be or not. She turned to face him directly. And I'd rather you know the geography of what you've walked into. He looked at her for a moment. At the careful architecture of her composure and the thing underneath it that wasn't quite as managed as the surface suggested. Understood, he said, and he meant more by it than the single word covered, and she knew that, and neither of them said so. He left the office and drove home through the Charlotte evening. The city moved around him the way it always did, indifferent, purposeful, continuing. He thought about the shape of what he was inside. Not just the job, the whole of it. The company and the brother and the man who made calls at night to say things that weren't quite threats. And Sandra Lee, who had been managing all of it alone for longer than anyone had thought to ask about. He pulled into his driveway. Sat in the truck for a moment before going in. The lights were off in the house, which meant Dorothy had gotten Elliot to bed on time, which meant the evening had gone smoothly, which meant he could stop holding his breath about that particular thing. He went inside. Stood at the kitchen counter. Did not make coffee this time. Just stood there in the quiet of the house and let the shape of the day settle around him like sediment after water stops moving. Then he went to bed. The article ran on a Thursday morning, local business publication, digital edition, posted at 7:15 before most people on the floor had finished their first coffee. Kenneth saw it on his phone before he walked in. Stood in the parking lot of Lee Automotive and read it twice. The headline was a question. The kind of question designed to be read as an answer. It asked whether Lee Automotive's recent executive hire represented a genuine business decision or a personal preference. And it made that question as suggestive as it could while remaining technically printable. There was a photograph. Him and Sandra on the floor, standing close during a walk-through review of the Jaguar E-Type. The angle made it look different than it was. Angles could do that when someone needed them to. The article didn't accuse, it implied. It used phrasing like, insider sources and, questions have been raised and, some observers have noted. It mentioned his lack of formal credentials without mentioning his 18 years of practical experience. It mentioned Sandra's authority over personnel decisions without mentioning that she was the reason the company functioned at the level it did. It was, he thought, a very precisely constructed piece of work. Not a hack job, a surgical one. The kind that required knowing exactly which questions to plant and which facts to leave out. He put his phone in his pocket and walked into the building. The floor noticed. Not loudly. But the way a room goes slightly quieter when something has happened that everyone knows about, and nobody is sure how to address that was present and unmistakable. Two of the senior technicians were in a conversation that stopped when he walked past. Brian Taylor was staring at his workbench with the expression of someone desperately trying to look like he hadn't just looked up from something on his phone. Edward Harris was already at his bench. He glanced at Kenneth when he came through. Held the look for 2 seconds, went back to work. That was, Kenneth realized, a form of solidarity from Edward. The deliberate choice to treat the morning like a morning, to not make it into something requiring acknowledgement or management. He went to his office, opened his project files, started the day. 40 minutes later, the sound of a phone call ending sharply came from Sandra's office overhead. Then footsteps on the stair. Then Sandra appeared at his office door. She looked the way a person looks when they have been having a conversation that required significant self-control and have just finished having it. Java set, eyes sharp. The particular composure of someone who has decided to hold it together and is succeeding through discipline rather than ease. "You've seen it," she said. "This morning, the board has already been in contact. 3 emails before 8:15, she came in. Sat in the chair across from his desk, not slumped, never slumped, but with the deliberateness of someone choosing to sit rather than stand, because standing would communicate something she didn't want communicated. Stephen called as well. What did he say? That this was exactly what he'd been worried about. That it created a perception problem. Her voice was level. He was right about the perception. He was wrong about the cause. He thinks I'm the problem. He thinks I created a vulnerability by acting on personal preference rather than professional criteria. A pause, his words. Kenneth leaned back in his chair. The floor was visible through the glass wall behind her, the Bel Air on the lift. Brian going through his morning checklist with the specific focus of someone trying very hard not to look at the office. Clark is behind the article, I believe so. The timing is too precise. The article asks exactly the question that would resonate with conservative board members who are already uncertain about the succession structure. She folded hands on the desk. Not a meeting gesture, just something to do with them. This is what he does. He doesn't fight directly. He introduces uncertainty. He lets other people's anxiety do the work. So what's the counter move? We release a formal statement from the company. My office, on official letterhead, correcting the factual errors and making clear that your hiring was merit-based with documented justification. She looked at him directly. And you keep doing the job, that's it? That's the part I can control. A pause. The part I can't control is whether the people in this building let it change how they operate. He thought about Edward's 2-second look. About Brian's desperate attempt to appear normal. The floor will be fine, she studied him. You sound sure. Edward Harris told me in my first week that the last outsider brought in sold the team's technical data to a competitor. He doesn't like me yet, not exactly, but he respected the work on the CUDA. He's not going to let a newspaper article undo that. He paused. People who respect work over politics are actually easier to read than you'd think. Something or expression shifted, not softened, clarified, like something coming into better focus. The statement goes out this afternoon. In the meantime, is the Jaguar on schedule? 2 days ahead. Good. She moved to the door. Stopped, turned back, Kenneth. I want you to know that I don't require you to be in the middle of this. If you want to be left out of whatever is happening with Clark and Stephen, I understand your job here is the floor. The rest of this is mine to manage. He looked at her for a moment, at the set of her shoulders. At the particular quality of stillness she carried, the stillness of someone who had been managing things alone for a long time, and had gotten very good at not asking for help, even when help was standing directly in front of her. I've been in the middle of it since day one, he said. Clark called me the first night. That wasn't an accident. He picked up the project folder. I'm not interested in stepping back from something I'm already standing in. She held his gaze for 1 breath. 2, then she went back upstairs, and the morning continued around the fact of both of them still being there. The sabotage happened on a Wednesday night between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning. Kenneth discovered it at 8:15 Thursday. He had come in early to run a systems check on the Roadrunner's rebuilt fuel delivery, which he preferred to do before the floor got loud. The car had been moved to the finishing bay overnight, standard procedure for vehicles at that stage. He noticed it when he got within 10 feet of the hood. The alignment was wrong, barely, but wrong. He opened the hood, looked, and then went very still for a long moment. Someone had been in the engine bay. They had removed and reinserted 3 components: the distributor, the primary fuel line bracket, and the secondary ignition coil mount. Reinserted them correctly, almost. Almost was the problem. The adjustments were precise enough to evade a casual inspection, but wrong enough that as her sustained road load, the ignition timing would degrade progressively. The car would run fine for the first 20 or 25 minutes. Then it would begin to fail. The customer was a private collector in Savannah. The Roadrunner was scheduled for delivery in 4 days. He checked the security log. The camera covering the finishing bay had a gap. 42 minutes, starting at 2:17 in the morning. Not a malfunction, the footage was simply gone. He did not touch the car, did not adjust anything. Pulled out his phone and called Sandra's direct line. She answered on the second ring. "Harris, I need you on the floor now." She came down in under 3 minutes, which meant she had been in the building already. She looked at what he showed her without touching anything. Her face did the thing where it went completely still, not blank, but like all available resources were being redirected to processing. "When did you notice?" 8:15. "I came in early. The camera gap, 42 minutes starting at 2:17. "It's not a technical failure." She turned away from the car, looked at the floor around them. Her hands were at her sides. She was thinking not in the dispersed, anxious way of someone overwhelmed by a problem, but in the focused inventory-taking way of someone deciding what to do with information they did not like but intended to handle. "Edward," she said, "should know. Needs to verify the assessment and file the technical record." He paused. "But nothing else. Not until we know the shape of this." "Why?" "Because whoever did this knew the camera coverage, knew the finishing bay layout, knew enough about the Roadrunner's ignition system to make the changes plausible." He kept his voice even. "That's not an outside job. This came from someone who knows this floor." The silence that followed was the specific quality of silence that follows something being said that was true but that nobody wanted to be true. The kind that settles into a room and stays. "You're not saying Edward," she said. "I'm saying I don't know, and until I know, I'd rather not narrow the field prematurely." She nodded once. "Get Edward. Keep it technical. I'll contact the external security firm this morning to pull the full system log independently." He found Edward at his bench in the main bay. Told him there was an issue with the Roadrunner that needed his verification. Kept his voice level and his face neutral. Edward, who had spent decades in environments where problems were communicated via machinery rather than language, heard everything in the tone that wasn't said and came immediately without asking questions. They stood at the Roadrunner's engine bay together for 4 minutes. Edward went through it methodically. Hands, eyes, measured reference against the spec sheet clipped to the nearby stand. He did not rush. He did not react visibly. He just looked, the way a person looks when they're building a picture they don't want to get wrong. Then he straightened. "This was intentional," he said, quiet, flat, like a man reading the result of a test he had hoped would come back differently. "Yes." Edward's jaw set, the camera gone, a pause. "Sandra knows. She knows. External firm coming today for the full log." Edward put the spec sheet down carefully, set it exactly parallel to the edge of the stand, the way a man handles things when everything else around him feels imprecise. "I've been on this floor for 11 years. I've never had a sabotage incident, I know. Which means either someone is trying very hard to create one now," he looked at Kenneth, "or someone has been waiting for an opportunity and I handed it to them without realizing. The second one isn't your fault. It's my floor," Edward said, simply, without self-pity, just the statement of a man who understood his own responsibility and was not looking for anyone to relieve him of it. "We fix the car. We document every change, and we find out who did this." Agreed. They spent the next 2 hours restoring the Roadrunner's systems to exact specification. Every removed component catalogued, every reinstalled one measured and confirmed. Every seasoning written down in a record that would be complete and unambiguous and argument-proof. Kenneth worked and Edward worked beside him, and neither of them said anything that wasn't about the car, because the car was what needed saying right now. At noon, Sandra came down with the preliminary results from the security firm. The camera gap had been created remotely, through the building's internal network, using access credentials that belonged to a user account that had been created 9 months ago and had never been used for anything else. 9 months ago, before Kenneth arrived, before the article, before any of this on the surface had begun, which meant the preparation for this had been running much longer than any of them had accounted for. Clark had not improvised the sabotage. He had built toward it. The ghost account, the newspaper article, the 9 months of quiet preparation, it was not a reaction to Kenneth's presence. It was a plan that had been executing before Kenneth existed in this equation at all. That evening, a Friday, Kenneth stayed late, not for work reasons. He wasn't ready to leave yet. He sat in his office with the lights low, looking at the floor below, running the timeline in his head. Sandra appeared in the doorway around 7. She had her coat on but hadn't left. She looked at him at his desk. "Go home," she said. "To Elliot, I know, he didn't move. I keep running the timeline." She came in, sat down across from him. She had the look of someone at the end of a long day who has made the calculation that the energy required to maintain full composure is no longer available. Not defeated, just honest. 9 months, he said. Clark has been building toward this for at least a year. Probably longer. She set her bag on the floor beside the chair. The ghost account on the network was created around the time he first approached Stephen, which means the sabotage was always an option, not the main play, a contingency. In case the primary approach going through Stephen met resistance, she looked at him, which it is. "Because of how this company actually runs. Because of you," he said. "Because of me." She said it without pride. Just accuracy. Clark underestimated how much operational control I actually have. He thought Stephen's name on the documentation was enough to create leverage. He didn't account for the fact that every person on that team answers to the work first and the paperwork second. Kenneth thought about Edward's words. "It's my floor," said quietly, without decoration. The absolute center of the man, Sandra. He waited until she looked at him. "How long have you been doing this alone?" She didn't answer immediately. Long enough that he thought she might redirect towards something safer. "Since my father died," she said finally. 7 years. 7 years. He let that land without rushing past it. "You should know," she said, "that I don't tell people things like that." "I know, I'm not sure why I'm telling you." He looked at her. At the particular quality of tiredness in her face that wasn't weakness was, in fact, the opposite of weakness. The specific look of someone who has been strong for so long that the body has begun to calculate the cost with an honesty the mind hasn't caught up to yet. "Maybe because you're tired of the weight of it being entirely yours," he said. She was very still. "I'm not offering to carry it," he continued. "That's not what I mean. I mean you don't have to make sure I can't see it." The silence between them was different from other silences, not empty, full of things neither of them had vocabulary for yet, or weren't ready to use, or had decided without deciding to let develop at the pace they were actually developing at rather than forcing into a shape. "The coffee machine in the break room," she said eventually. He recognized the redirect and let her have it. "Is terrible. It's genuinely bad. I've been meaning to replace it for 6 months. What's stopping you?" She looked at him. That fractional curve at the corner of her mouth that was the anterior version of a smile. "I forget about it when I'm here and I don't care about it when I'm not. Classic problem. I have a lot of them." She stood up, picked up her bag. "Go home, tow your kid, Kenneth." In a minute, she looked at him from the doorway. The light from the floor behind her caught the angles of her face in a different way than the office light did. Not different person, just different angle. Same person seen from somewhere new. "Thank you," she said. "For this morning. For staying calm when it mattered. That's the job." "No," she said. "It isn't actually. It's who you are." She turned to go. "There's a difference." And then she was gone down the stair, and the floor was quiet. And Kenneth sat with that sentence for a while before he finally went home. 3 days later, his phone rang at 2:17 in the afternoon. Number he didn't recognize. He answered in the middle of a parts review. The voice was pleasant, careful, exactly as pleasant and careful as the last time. "Calibrated to the millimeter, Mr. Harris. Jeffrey Clark. I wanted to check in. See how things going after what I understand was a difficult week. I'm managing fine. I'm glad." A breath of warmth that was entirely constructed. "I've been thinking about you, actually. About your son." Kenneth went very still. "A single parent carrying this kind of professional weight, it's a lot," Clark continued. "And of course, stability matters so much at that age. 9, is he?" Another pause. Deliberate. Placed exactly where it needed to be to land. It would be unfortunate if the pressures of this situation were to affect the kind of settled environment children need. The temperature of Kenneth's voice dropped about 10 degrees. "Say what you mean." "I mean that I hope you're taking care of yourself," Clark said. Still pleasant, still careful. The practiced concern of a man who had rehearsed this particular register many times, and that you're thinking about the long game. "What's good for you?" "What's good for Elliot?" He paused. "Not just what Sandra Lee has told you is good. Are you threatening my son?" "Of course not," immediately. The practiced offendedness of someone who had prepared for exactly this question and had the answer ready before it was asked. I would never. I'm expressing concern. Genuinely, a beat. I just want you to know that if you ever felt the current situation wasn't serving your interests or your family's, there would be options. Better options, potentially, than what you have now, the line held. Kenneth's grip on the phone was controlled, deliberately controlled. The kind of controlled that takes work. I want you to understand something clearly, he said, low and precise. I'm not a lever. I'm not a pressure point. And I'm not someone who can be moved by implied threats dressed up as friendly advice. He paused. Don't call this number again. He hung up, stood for a moment with his hand flat on the desk. Then he texted Dorothy. Everything okay with Elliot? Her response came in 40 seconds. He's here, fine. Ate 2 sandwiches. Why? He stared at that for a moment. Good, he typed back. Then he called Sandra. She answered before the second ring. Harris, Clark just called me. He kept his voice even. He referenced Elliot. The pause was exactly 1 second. Precise as a gap in a security feed, then, come upstairs. He went upstairs, and the next move in a game he hadn't chosen to enter was already being made before he sat down. The school called the following Tuesday at 10:40 in the morning. He was in the middle of reviewing the finished Jaguar's documentation for final sign-off. The screen lit up. Charlotte Elementary. He picked it up before the second ring, Mr. Harris. This is Principal Dawson. A pause that loaded itself before the next words arrived. I want you to know that Elliot is completely fine. But I'm calling because we received a contact this morning that I need to discuss with you in person. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He walked out of his office, told Brian Taylor he was leaving, and was in his truck in under 4 minutes. Elliot was sitting in the main office in a chair that was too large for him. Not crying, not frightened. Wearing the expression of a 9-year-old who has understood that something adult and serious is happening around him and is waiting for someone he trusts to explain it. The sight of his son in that chair did something to Kenneth's chest that was not quite describable in any precise way. It was the feeling of every calculation of risk he had ever made, becoming suddenly and completely personal. He crossed the room, crouched in front of Elliot, looked at him. You okay? Elliot looked back with Claire's directness. I'm fine. Are you okay? I'm good. He put one hand on Elliot's shoulder briefly, stood, went into Principal Dawson's office. The principal was a careful man. Gray-templed, deliberate, visibly uncomfortable with the thing he was about to say. We received a call this morning from someone representing themselves as a child welfare follow-up service. They indicated there had been an anonymous report submitted regarding the stability of your son's home environment. Financial concerns, some reference to they mentioned a prior legal record. Kenneth's jaw set. My record was expunged, I understand that. And I want to be clear, I have no concern about Elliot's care. He is visibly healthy, engaged, thriving. This is not, Dawson stopped, restarted. I'm required to log contacts of this nature, but I want you to know that I do not take this at face value. The person who called did not identify their employer, did not leave a callback number. A pause. The call was flagged as unusual by our administrative staff before it reached me. Kenneth thanked him, said what needed to be said, collected Elliot and walked him to the truck. They sat in the parking lot for a moment. Elliot had his backpack on his lap. He was looking at the dashboard with the expression of someone organizing their thoughts before speaking, which was something he had gotten from his mother and from his father in approximately equal measure. What happened? Elliot said. Not scared, just direct. Someone made a call to your school saying things about me that weren't true. Trying to cause problems. Elliot thought about this with genuine seriousness. Because of the job, because of things that are connected to the job. Did it work? No. Elliot nodded, looked back at the dashboard, tapped his fingers once on his backpack strap. You always say you can't control what other people do. You can only control what you do back. Kenneth looked at his son. At the familiar slope of his nose, the way he held his jaw when he was thinking through something that mattered. So much of Claire in him. So much of something that was entirely its own thing and nobody else's. Yeah, he said. I do say that. So what are you going to do back? He started the truck. Let it run for a second. Let the engine do what engines do, find its rhythm, settle into itself, become the thing it was built to be. I'm going to go back to work, Kenneth said, and I'm going to end this. Elliot looked at him for a long moment. Then he settled back in his seat. Okay, he said, simply. Like that was all that needed saying. He drove. The afternoon was clear, Charlotte moving around them in its ordinary, purposeful way. His kid beside him, and the specific weight of knowing that someone had reached through everything and put a hand near the one thing Kenneth Harris could not be reasonable about. He called Sandra from the driveway when Elliot was inside. She picked up on the first ring, he told her. All of it, the call from the school. What Dawson had said, the reference to his record, the silence on her end was very short. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of something that has been held at a certain temperature for a long time and has just changed. He went after Elliot, she said. He went after Elliot. Then we're done waiting. Her voice was steel and decision, and something that was not quite anger but was in the same family. I'm calling Margaret tonight. He leaned his head back against the headrest. Outside, through the window, he could see the light in the kitchen where Dorothy had turned something on. Elliot moving inside, the ordinary shape of a Tuesday afternoon that had been something else and was trying to come back to itself. Okay, he said. Let's end it. George White arrived in Charlotte on a Wednesday morning, driving a truck that had seen better decades and carrying exactly one duffel bag, which was precisely how George approached everything, with the minimum required luggage and the maximum available attention. Kenneth met him in the parking lot outside of the apartment. George got out, looked at him, looked at the building behind him, looked back at him. You look tired, George said. I'm fine. That's what tired people say. He pulled the duffel from the back seat. Tell me everything, so Kenneth told him. Not in the parking lot. They went inside. Kenneth made coffee that was better than the break room machine at Lee Automotive, but not by a margin that would win any awards, and he laid it out from beginning to end. The USB, Margaret Scott, and the 6 weeks of documentation she had built quietly while everyone else was looking at other things. Stephen and the ghost account on the network, and the 9-month preparation timeline that predated Kenneth's arrival entirely. Jeffrey Clark calling about Elliot, the school. All of it, in order, without editorializing. George listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without the particular impatience that made most people interject with their own thoughts before you'd finish expressing yours. He sat with his coffee cup and he heard every word. Then he said, When does the signing happen? Friday. 10 in the morning. Stephen and Clark at the Ballantine Hotel. 3rd floor, conference suite. Kenneth paused. Margaret found the calendar entry in the shared executive system. Stephen didn't take it off the company server. George turned his cup in his hand slowly, which means either he didn't think to, or he wanted someone to find it. Kenneth had thought about this. Had turned it over every way it could be turned. I don't know which. Does Sandra know which? She doesn't know yet. He looked at his coffee. She's been focused on the regulatory filing. She and Margaret have been working through the documentation to make sure the SEC submission is clean, no gaps, nothing that can be challenged on procedural grounds. If they file before Friday, the signing becomes irrelevant because Clark's access to capital for the transaction gets frozen pending review. And if they can't file before Friday, then the signing happens and Clark gets his stake before anyone can stop it. And once he has it, unwinding it takes years of litigation, even if everything we have holds up. George was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was building something in his head rather than waiting for more information. Then, what do you need from me? This was the thing about George. He never asked whether you'd made the right call. He never asked whether you were sure or whether you'd considered the other angles. He asked what you needed, because he had decided, somewhere along the line, that if you had called him, the call itself was reason enough. I need eyes on Stephen for the next 3 days, Kenneth said. I need to know who goes in and out of his office, who he meets with outside the building, whether there's any sign he's wavering from the Friday plan. Wavering, I went to see him. Before I called you, he held George's look steadily. I told him what Clark was actually planning, that a man who needs a door doesn't keep the door around after he's through it. George absorbed this, set his cup down. How did he take it? He didn't say anything. He read what I put in front of him, and he set it down carefully, and he didn't say anything. Kenneth paused. Which is either nothing or everything. With family it's usually everything, George said. The nothing is just what it looks like from outside, I know. George stood up, refilled his coffee without asking, the way he had always done in any kitchen he'd spent more than 10 minutes in. Sat back down. Okay, I'll watch the building. I'll figure out the rest as I go. He looked at Kenneth across the table with the direct, uncomplicated regard of someone who had been a friend for 15 years and found the role suited him. "And you and me what? You look like a man who's been holding something at arm's length and telling himself it's because he's being professional." Kenneth said nothing, the woman, George said. Not a question, not an accusation, just an observation delivered by someone who was done pretending not to have made it. Not the point right now. Sure, George picked up his cup. It never is, until it is. He drank his coffee, looked out the kitchen window at the October morning doing its particular thing with the light. "You'd do the same for me," he said. "If I called, you know I would." "Yeah." He set the cup down. "So stop thanking me and tell me where this Ballantine Hotel is." Sandra and Margaret Scott had been in the conference room on the second floor for most of Tuesday and all of Wednesday. Kenneth knew this not because he was tracking Sandra specifically, but because Margaret had a particular energy when she was in sustained working mode of focused, slightly reduced social radius that the rest of the floor had learned to read over 18 years as a signal not to bring her non-essential questions. He checked in with the active projects in the morning. The Roadrunner was ready for final documentation before Savannah delivery, which had been postponed by 3 days while the sabotage investigation completed. This Jaguar had gone out on Tuesday, and the client had sent a note to Margaret that she passed along to Kenneth. Without comment, the note said the car was exactly right. And that was the full extent of it, which was the best possible review a restoration could receive. No adjectives, no enthusiasm, just exactly right. The team had read it and gone back to work, which was also exactly right. Edward Harris found him in the Roadrunner bay at noon, came in without preamble, stood at a reasonable distance with the body language of a man who had thought through what he wanted to say and had edited it down to the necessary parts. "Word's getting around that there's something happening with the company structure," he said. "There's something happening," Kenneth confirmed. Sandra's managing it. Edward looked at the Roadrunner, at the newly documented engine bay, at the detailed log clipped to the stand that recorded every component touched during the sabotage repair, every measurement, every restored specification, the record that would stand up to anything. "The ghost account," he said. "I've been thinking about it." Kenneth waited. "Edward was not a man you rushed. 9 months ago, we had a systems upgrade. External contractor came in to update the network security infrastructure. His old jaw was set the way it got when he was saying something he'd been turning over for a while and had finally decided needed saying. I didn't handle that process. Stephen's office coordinated it. The implication settled between them in the quiet of the bay. You're saying the account was created during the contractor's access window, Kenneth said. I'm saying it's possible. I'm not saying I know. A pause. I'm saying Sandra should have this information if she doesn't already have it. I'll make sure she does. Edward nodded. Once. Clean. The nod of a man who has delivered what he came to deliver and considers the matter transferred. Then he looked at Kenneth with an expression that was the closest thing to unguarded he had produced in 9 weeks. This floor runs because of the work. Whatever happens upstairs, I need you to know that the team will hold. Kenneth looked at him, at the 11 years in the set of his shoulders, at the way he occupied this space like a load-bearing wall, not decorative, not movable, absolutely necessary. I know, he said. Good. Edward turned, stopped. Without turning back, addressed the middle distance. You were right about the cam bearing in the CUDA. Week 1. A pause. I've been in this business long enough to know that means something. He walked away before Kenneth had to figure out what to say to that, which was, Kenneth thought, also characteristic of the man. Brian Taylor appeared at his elbow approximately 90 seconds after Edward disappeared around the corner, with the timing of someone who had been waiting nearby and had set themselves a polite interval before approaching. Is everything going to be okay? Brian said. With the company. He said it the way young people say things they've been holding for a while in a rush. Before the nerve runs out, Kenneth looked at him. At the 25-year-old who had been on this floor for 3 years and had walked Kenneth into a supply cabinet on his first tour and had bought 7 wrong coffees to celebrate the CUDA fix, and who asked more questions per hour than anyone Kenneth had ever worked with, and who, underneath all of it, cared genuinely about where he worked and the work he did. Yes, Kenneth said. It's going to be okay. Brian exhaled in a way that suggested he'd been holding more than he'd shown, nodded. went back to his bay with the specific visible relief of someone who needed to hear exactly that and now could work again. Thursday morning. 3 things happened before 10 o'clock. The first, Margaret confirmed to Sandra that the SEC submission package was complete. Every document verified, every transfer traced through the intermediary holding company to its origin, every correspondence thread archived with provenances intact. The submission could be filed by electronic form within 30 minutes of a final decision to proceed. Margaret delivered this information to Sandra in the conference room at 8:15, in the tone of someone reporting a measurement rather than an achievement, because for Margaret Scott, the work being correct was the baseline, not the accomplishment. The second, George White texted Kenneth at 8:47. 3 words. Stephen left early. The third, Kenneth's phone rang at 9:03, a number he had never seen before. He picked it up on the second ring, Harris, Stephen Lee's voice. Not the managed, calibrated version from their encounter in his office 5 weeks ago. Something underneath that. Something scraped down to the material under the surface. I need to talk to you, okay. Not on the phone. A pause in which something was being decided. There's a coffee place on Park Road. Grounds on South, you know it? I'll find it. 20 minutes, he told Sandra where he was going before he left. She looked at him for a moment, the particular attention of someone recalibrating their picture of a situation in real time, adjusting for a variable that had moved without warning. He called you, she said. He called me, not you. He watched her face. I think that's intentional, she exhaled slowly. The exhale of someone who understood why and was deciding how to feel about it. Go, she said. Grounds on South was a neighborhood place that operated on the quality of what came out of the machine, and the fact that the tables were clean and nobody played music loud enough to make conversation an effort. Stephen Lee was in the back corner when Kenneth arrived. He had lost the suit jacket, no tie. A dark gray pullover that made him look less like a board meeting and more like a person who was tired and had stopped managing his appearance for the last 12 hours or so. He looked like he hadn't slept. Not the performative sleeplessness of someone who wanted you to know they'd been working hard. The real kind. Kenneth ordered at the counter, brought his coffee to the table, sat down across from Stephen and said nothing. Let the silence do the first piece of work. Some silences were gaps to be filled. This one was a space for something to arrive. Stephen looked at his own cup. At the table, finally at Kenneth. You came to see me and you put that document in front of me and you told me Clark was going to discard me when he was through. Yes, why? The question was real. Stephen was asking it without the layering of professional courtesy, without the management of impression. He wanted to understand the actual motivation, because it didn't fit any model he'd been operating with, and that gap was bothering him more than anything else about the situation. Because you're Sandra's brother, Kenneth said. And because whatever you've gotten yourself into with Clark, I don't think you understood what it was when you started. Stephen turned his cup up in both hands. That's a generous read, maybe. Kenneth picked up his coffee. Also because the alternative was watching something your grandfather built get taken apart by someone who never spent a day caring about what it actually was. Something moved across Stephen's face. Not grief, exactly. The functional cousin of it, the specific feeling of a man who has been reminded of something he knew and had been successfully avoiding thinking about. A thing that had been true the whole time and was still true and was now unavoidable. He started approaching me 2 years ago, Stephen said. Clark, I didn't know who he was at first. He came through a mutual contact, presented it as an investment opportunity. Stabilization capital, he called it. Said the company's succession structure was a liability risk and he had a solution that protected everyone. A pause. He made it sound like the responsible thing, like protecting what the family built, and later I understood more of what he actually wanted. But by then I had signed preliminary agreements and he had things I'd said in writing and he stopped, pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose. I convinced myself it was manageable, that I could control how far it went, that I could keep it contained. He looked up. I was wrong about that. Kenneth said nothing. Let him stay in it. Let the silence be what it needed to be rather than filling it with reassurance that wasn't his to give. You told me that Clark doesn't need the door after he's through it, Stephen said. I already knew that. I think I knew it for months. I just needed someone to say it out loud in a room where I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard it. A pause. Sandra would have said it. But she would have also been right about everything else at the same time, and I wasn't ready to hear all of it at once. And now I have a meeting in 20 hours that I am trying to decide what to do with. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing something visible. If I don't show up, he'll escalate. He has enough in writing to cause problems even if it never succeeds legally. Cause problems how litigation. Nothing that would ultimately succeed, but enough to create uncertainty for 18 months. Investors get nervous, the restoration floor loses contracts. People on that team, he stopped. Started again. People like Edward Harris lose work that spent their lives building. Because of something I did, Kenneth set down his cup, looked at Stephen Lee across a corner table in a neighborhood coffee shop on a Thursday morning in October. At the man under the suit, under the surface competence, under the years of occupying a position that was never quite his and never quite not his. A man who had been afraid for a long time and had made bad choices from inside that fear, and had just, in this specific moment, at this specific table, decided to make a different one. "What do you need from Sandra?" Kenneth said. Stephen was quiet. "You called me," Kenneth said, "not her, which means you're not ready to call her yet. But you're going to have to." He held Stephen's gaze. "What happens when you do? She's going to be angry. Probably. She's going to be right. Definitely." Steve looked down at his cup. The quiet of the coffee shop held around them the low murmur of other conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, the sound of a Thursday morning in the city proceeding without awareness of or interest in what was being decided at this particular table. "I have documentation," Stephen said finally, "of the meetings, the correspondence. Things Clark said in person that I recorded because I started to understand what he was doing, and I didn't know what still to do with the understanding." He reached into the pocket of the gray pullover, set a small external drive on the table between them. "I've had this for 3 months." Kenneth looked at the drive, then at Stephen. "You didn't know what to do with it," he said carefully. "Or you weren't ready to do anything with it." The distinction landed. Stephen looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone being accurately read by a person they had not expected to read them accurately. Then, "The second one? Okay." Kenneth picked up the drive. "I'm going to take this to Sandra, and you're going to call her today." "Not tonight. Today," he paused. "And when she's angry, you're going to let her be." Stephen held his gaze. "She's going to say I should have come to her earlier. She's going to be right, I know." A pause that carried the weight of someone who had known something for a long time and is acknowledging it out loud for the first time. "I've known that for a while." Kenneth stood up, left a 10 on the table, looked at Stephen Lee one more time. Then he went back to Lee Automotive. Sandra's office, 11:15 in the morning. He set both drives on her desk. The USB that Margaret had compiled over 6 weeks of quiet, meticulous work, and Stephen's. She looked at them, then at him. "Where did you get the second one, Stephen?" The silence was significant in the way only silences about family can be. "He called you," she said. "This morning he called you, not accusation. Something more complicated than that, the specific texture of feeling that comes from understanding that the person closest to you went to someone else first, and that the someone else handled it correctly, and that both of those things are simultaneously true, and neither one erases the other, and you have to hold them both at the same time. Because he couldn't call me. Not yet. He will today." Kenneth sat in the chair across from her desk. "He's been collecting documentation of his own for 3 months. Recordings, correspondence. He didn't know what to do with it. He was afraid of what I'd say." "Yes, I would have." She stopped, started differently, chose of a more accurate word. "I would have been angry." I told him that. She looked at him. "What else did you tell him? That when you were, he should let you be?" Something in her face, a fractional, controlled release, like a joint in a structure-absorbing load the way it was designed to. Not collapse, not relief exactly. Adjustment. The kind that lets the building continue to stand while the pressure inside it changes. She looked at the 2 drives on her desk. Then she picked up her phone and called Margaret. Margaret Scott appeared in the doorway in under 2 minutes. She looked at the drives. She looked at Sandra. She looked at Kenneth with the expression of someone who has been waiting for this specific convergence of events and is professionally declining to say so. "The second drive has Stephen's recordings," Sandra said. "We need to assess it against what we already have before we file. I need to know if there are conflicts, gaps, or anything that complicates the submission." How long? Kenneth asked. Margaret was already picking up both drives with the deliberate care of someone who understood exactly what she was holding. 2 hours, maybe less. We have until tomorrow morning before the meeting time, Kenneth said. Then I'll be done in 2 hours? Margaret said. She was before either of them could respond. Sandra sat back in her chair. For a moment she looked at the window that overlooked the floor below, the road runner gleaming under the work lights, the bays occupied, the team moving through the rhythms of a serious working day. The ordinary version of something that was not underneath its surface, ordinary at all. He's been afraid for 2 years, she said, and I knew he was afraid. I could see it every time he walked into a room with me. I just couldn't, she paused. Selected the accurate word. I couldn't find the way in. Every time I tried, he redirected. He had very good redirects. You don't have to have done it perfectly, Kenneth said. Nobody does, she looked at him. You sound very calm for someone who had their son's school called. I'm not calm. I'm managing. He met her eyes steadily. There's a difference. She held his gaze for a moment with an expression that was the closest thing to unguarded he had seen from her outside of the late-night break room conversation. Stephen is going to need the company to still exist when this is over, she said. He needs to know that what his grandfather built didn't get destroyed because of what he did. Tell him that, I will. A pause in which the timing of this was being worked out. When I'm done being angry, he almost smiled. Didn't quite. Fair, he stood. Go do something useful. I'll call you when Margaret's ready. She looked at him, then back at the floor. Then she picked up her phone to call Stephen. He went downstairs and spent the next 2 hours doing exactly what he'd been hired to do. The road runner's final pre-delivery check. The Camaro intake form for the Richmond vehicle arriving Tuesday. A technical review of the Dugenberg's progress with the team lead assigned to it. Work. The specific ordinary work of a person who had a job worth doing. He let it take up the part of his brain that wanted to run scenarios, and it did, and that was why work mattered. George texted at 2:18. 3 words again. Stephen's in the building. Kenneth didn't go upstairs. Whatever was happening in Sandra's office between her and her brother was between them, and the integrity of that space required him to stay exactly where he was. He kept his hands busy and his eyes on the work. Brian Taylor materialized at his elbow at 2:45. Not gossip. More like a weather report delivered by someone who felt responsible for the atmospheric conditions. There's a lot of back and forth happening on the second floor, he said quietly. Just thought you should know. Thanks, Taylor. Also, the coffee machine in the break room made a sound this morning that I feel like we should address at some point later. Yeah, a pause. The Roadrunner looks good. It does. Brian didn't move immediately, stood there for a moment with the expression of someone who has more to say and is deciding whether to say it. Then, is everything going to be okay? With the company, he'd asked this before 2 days ago, and Kenneth had answered it. He was asking again because 2 days ago the situation had been theoretical, and now the back and forth on the second floor was audible, and theory had become fact. Yes, Kenneth said. Same answer, same certainty, because the answer hadn't changed. It's going to be okay, Brian exhaled, nodded, went back to his bay, Edward Harris. From across the floor gave Kenneth a single look that lasted less than 2 seconds. The look said, "You said the right thing," again. Then he went back to what he was doing. At 4:15, Sandra called him upstairs. Margaret was in the conference room, laptop open. Printed pages organized in 2 parallel stacks with the precision of someone who had done this work before and understood that accuracy was the only currency that would matter in the rooms this was eventually going to reach. Stephen was seated at the far end of the table. He had the look of a man who has said difficult things and survived the saying of them and is recalibrating what that means about what comes next. Sandra was standing. The documentation from both sources is consistent, Margaret said. No conflicts, no gaps that can't be explained by timeline. Together it builds a complete and unambiguous picture of a transaction structured to trigger a governance clause through manufactured consent. She looked at Kenneth briefly, then back to Sandra. The recordings Stephen provided include Clark explicitly describing the intended outcome, including the removal of Sandra from operational authority. The room held this. We're ready to file, Sandra said. The question is when, before the meeting tomorrow, Kenneth said. If the filing is confirmed before 10, Clark loses the capital access and the meeting becomes irrelevant. He can show up if he wants. There'll be nothing to sign. The electronic filing is timestamped on confirmation, Margaret said. We submit tonight. Confirmation comes through by morning. Tonight then, Sandra said. Stephen looked at the table for a moment, then at Sandra. I want to be on the filing. She looked at him, as a corroborating party. Not just as a subject of the documentation. He held her gaze. It cost him, visibly. I want to be on the right side of the record. The silence that followed was its own kind of resolution, not the absence of things being said, but the completion of something that had been circling toward its landing for a long time. The specific silence of a door that has finally been walked through. Sandra said, "Then you will be." Margaret filed the submission at 9:17 in the evening. Kenneth was in Sandra's office when the confirmation came through. A small alert on Margaret's screen, a reference number, a timestamp, the accumulation of 6-week meticulous work and 3 months of Stephen's recordings and 18 years of Margaret Scott, knowing this company's financial architecture better than anyone alive, reduced to a string of numbers on a screen. Margaret looked at it, printed the confirmation page, set it on the desk. Done, she said. Sandra picked up the letter. Read the confirmation number. Set it back down. She did not look triumphant. She looked like a woman who has finished carrying something heavy and is giving her body a moment to register the absence of the weight before deciding what to do next. Stephen, who had stayed through the filing because he had decided that staying was the minimum he could offer, stood up from his chair at the far end of the table. He looked at Sandra. She looked at him. The specific conversation that happens entirely without words between two people who have known each other their whole lives and have just navigated something that could have ended very differently and didn't. "I'm sorry," Stephen said. The words came out without performance, just the plain thing itself offered without the protective coating of context or explanation. Just the words. Sandra nodded once. Not forgiveness. Not yet. That would take time, and she was not a woman who rushed things that deserved to take time. But not refusal either. The held space of something that intended to resolve and choosing to do it properly. "I know," she said. Margaret gathered her materials with the efficiency of someone who understood that she was the third person in a room that needed to become two. She paused at the door, looked at Kenneth with the particular regard of someone who has been paying attention to more than the paperwork for several weeks and considers her assessment complete. Then she left. Kenneth moved toward the door as well. Sandra's voice, quiet. "Harris." He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for going to see him. He needed someone without a history in the room." "I know." She looked at him with the grey eyes that had been the first thing he'd registered about her on a highway shoulder. In August, the eyes that processed things and filed them and did not waste time on things that didn't matter. "That's what I'm thanking you for." Understanding what he needed and doing it without being asked, he held her look for a moment. The office was quiet. The floor below was dark, the overnight lights casting the cars in the particular half-light that made them look like they had always been here and would always be here. Objects with accumulated meaning, resting. "You going to be okay tonight?" he asked. "Yes." Then honestly, "Maybe that's good enough." She almost smiled, the anterior version of one. "Go home to Elliot," he went. The drive home was quiet in the way of late October nights in Charlotte, clear and cool, and the city doing the particular thing it did after 10 when the working day had fully released, and what remained was the city itself rather than the people using it. He drove and let his mind run slower than it had run in weeks. 3 days ago, he had not known whether Stephen would make a different choice. 2 hours ago, the filing had gone through. Tomorrow morning, Jeffrey Clark would arrive at a hotel conference suite and wait for a signing that was not going to happen. And whatever he did with that information was his to manage. It was over. Or the acute part was over. The rest would be what it was: regulatory process, legal noise, the slow unwinding of things Clark had put in motion. But the center of it was done. He pulled into his driveway, sat in the truck for a moment. Through the window he could see the light Dorothy had left on in the kitchen. She had stayed late with Elliot and had left the light on the way she always did, a habit from when Kenneth was a child that had simply continued without anyone deciding to continue it. The light meant someone was here. Someone cared that you came home. He went inside, stood at the kitchen counter. The house was quiet, with the specific quality of a house where a child has been put to bed by someone who is good at it. He stood there for a moment and let the shape of the evening settle. Then he went to bed and slept in a way he hadn't slept in several weeks, not dreamlessly, but without the particular restlessness of someone managing an unresolved problem. The problem was resolved. The sleep knew it. Friday morning, 10:02. Kenneth was at his desk reviewing the Camaro intake documentation when his phone lit up. George White. He answered immediately. "Clark showed up at the hotel," George said. His voice had the measured quality of someone delivering a report they have been preparing for. Conference suite, third floor. He was there at 9:50 with his attorney. They set up. Waited, a pause. Stephen didn't come. 9:58. Clark got a call. Stood up while he was on it. His attorney started packing the documents. Another pause. They left at 10:04. Clark looked like a man who had just been told that the building he thought he owned had been sold out from under him while he was standing in it. Did he make calls? Several. In the parking lot on the way to his car, in the car, George paused. Whatever news he was getting on those calls was not improving his morning. His attorney looked like he wanted to be somewhere else. Kenneth leaned back in his chair. Through the glass wall of his office, he could see Brian Taylor doing something to a clipboard that seemed to involve more of vision than the clipboard probably warranted. Edward Harris at his bench, steady, the floor operating at its normal morning register. The Duesenberg at the far end under its cover, waiting for the team assigned to it next week. Ordinary. The specific ordinariness of a place where serious work happened and serious people showed up for it every morning, regardless of what was happening upstairs or outside, or anywhere that wasn't the work. "George," he said. "Yeah, thank you, anytime." A beat that contained everything George didn't say about the last 4 days. "Am I inviter to something resembling a meal, or are you going to make me drive back to a city that doesn't have decent barbecue without feeding me first? Come to the floor. I'll figure something out. That's not a meal. It's what I've got right now." George made the sound that meant he was satisfied but had decided not to admit it. "Fine. I'll be there by noon." He hung up. Sandra came to the floor at 11. Not her usual afternoon timing, 11, which was the timing of someone who had been up since before the filing confirmation and had been tracking the morning as it developed. She came to Kenneth's office doorway. He looked up. "Clark arrived at the hotel," she said. "I know." George called. She nodded. She had the look of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing to be confirmed and has just had it confirmed and is now recalibrating to the reality that comes after. "The SEC has the submission. The process runs from here." She paused. "It's slow. It'll be months before anything formal happens to Clark. But the transaction is dead. He can't move on the stake without capital access, and the filing freezes that." "I know," he said again. She looked at him for a moment across his office. "You knew it was going to work," she said. "I thought it was going to work. Those aren't the same thing." "No," she agreed. "They're not." She looked at the floor below, at the Roadrunner gleaming in the finishing bay, cleared and documented and ready. "The Roadrunner delivery is this afternoon, 2 o'clock. I'm driving it down myself." She looked back at him. "You don't have to do that. We have delivery staff, I know." He held her gaze. "I want to see it get there." Something in her expression did the thing it did, that small clarification, that fractional settling into something more honest than the professional surface. "All right," she said, and she went back upstairs. George arrived at 11:50, driving his enduring argument of a truck, which he parked in the visitor space with the casual confidence of someone who considered the concept of visitors somewhat limiting as a category. He came onto the floor and looked around with the expression of a man encountering something that was bigger and more real than the version in his head, which he was not going to say out loud. Brian Taylor found him inside of 3 minutes. This was, Kenneth felt, essentially inevitable. "Are you here for the car stuff?" Brian said with the energy of someone who assumed everyone was here for the car stuff. "I'm here for him." George pointed at Kenneth across the floor without looking away from the Duesenberg under its cover. Brian looked at Kenneth, looked at George. "Are you guys like friends?" Kenneth said from across the floor. "Since we were 20, George confirmed. Before he got the nice job. It's the same job," Kenneth said. "Different building, different zip code," George said. "Different class of problem." He looked around at the cars with the unhurried attention of someone who respected things that took real skill to build. Nice floor, though. Brian appeared to find this very satisfying. He took George on an unrequested tour that lasted 22 minutes, during which Kenneth completed his documentation reviews and Edward Harris. Passing George in the main bay, gave him a single assessing look, and then a brief nod which, for Edward, was the rough equivalent of a formal welcome ceremony. Sandra came down at noon. George saw her and went briefly very still, in the way of someone suppressing an immediate reaction. He looked at Kenneth. Kenneth looked back at him with the expression of a man who has communicated not now with his face more times than he can count. George looked back at Sandra with the composed interest of someone who had received the message and was choosing to respect it while privately filing everything for later review. "George White," Sandra said. Because Margaret had told her, and Margaret always told her what she needed to know, "Miss Lee." George shook her hand with the straightforward grip of someone who treated everyone the same way until it gave him reason to do otherwise. "Kenneth says good things. He said you were the most reliable person he knew, and also the most relentless about it." George absorbed this. That's the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about me, Sandra almost smiled. I doubt it's the most accurate, but it'll do. She and Kenneth went through the afternoon's operational priorities with the practical efficiency of people who had learned to work in close proximity without making it mean more than it was in front of others. The road runner delivery, the Duesenberg assessment schedule, the Camaro intake Tuesday, normal forward. One car and then another. Around 3 in the afternoon, Margaret came to the floor with a printed note that she gave to Sandra without comment. Sandra read it. Her expression did not change dramatically, but something in the set of her face settled in a way that hadn't been settled for a long time, not since Kenneth had known her, and possibly longer than that. The SEC has confirmed receipt and opened a preliminary review, she said. Formal notification to the involved parties goes out Monday, which Jeffrey Clark would know by Monday morning that the ground had moved. That the transaction he had spent 2 years building in careful, patient increments, the ghost account, the newspaper article, the call about Elliot, the 9 months of preparation that predated Kenneth's arrival entirely had encountered a wall built out of 18 years of Margaret Scott's institutional knowledge, and Kenneth Harris's decision to stop on the side of a highway in August. Okay, Kenneth said. Okay, Sandra confirmed. Edward Harris walked past at that precise moment carrying a tool tray toward the finishing bay. He glanced at them, glanced at the floor, kept walking. But there was something different in the quality of his stride. The slight, nearly imperceptible easing of a man who has been holding tension in his shoulders long enough that he's stopped noticing it and has just noticed it releasing. That evening, after the floor cleared, after George had been taken to a barbecue place on Tryon Street that met his standards after a 20-minute negotiation about which place to go to, after the Roadrunner had been delivered to Savannah exactly right, and the collector had shaken Kenneth's hand at the door of his garage and said nothing else because nothing else was needed. After all of that, Sandra came down to the floor. Not for work reasons, or not only. She came to the floor the way people go to places that have mattered during difficult stretches, to stand in them when the difficult stretch is over and see what they look like in the different light. Kenneth was still there. He had come back from Savannah at 7 and had gone to his office to finish the delivery documentation because it needed to be done, and doing it was easier than not doing it. She appeared in the doorway, looked at him at his desk. That documentation isn't urgent, she said. No, then why are you still here? He set down the pen. Because I'm not quite ready to leave yet. He watched her. Is that a problem? She came in, sat down across from his desk. Not the working posture. Not the composure of someone managing a room. A different arrangement of herself, less structured. The way people sit when the performance of the day has fully ended and what's left is the actual person underneath it. Clark will receive formal notification Monday, she said. His attorney will call mine immediately. There will be a period of noise before it gets quiet. How long? Months, possibly. But the transaction is dead. Whatever he does now is defensive. Not offensive, she looked at him. He lost. Yes, because you went to see Stephen. Because Stephen made a choice, he said. I just gave him the information he needed to make it. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the office, the floor was in its overnight configuration. The Duesenberg at the far end, the empty bay where the Roadrunner had been, already being prepped for the next intake. The bays waiting for the work that would come in next week, and the week after that, and the week after that, because the work did not stop and that was the point of it. I've been thinking, Sandra said, about something you said. Weeks ago. In the break room. A pause. You said I didn't need someone asking more questions. I needed someone who knew when to listen. I remember I've been running this company for 7 years, since my father died, and I'm very good at it. I know that, not arrogance. Evidence. She looked at him steadily. But being good at something doesn't mean it isn't heavy. The words landed in the particular way of things said aloud, for the first time after being true for a long time in private. It's been heavy, she said. I haven't said that to anyone. Kenseth looked at her. At the woman who had been holding a company and a family structure and a years-long infiltration attempt, and her own grief about all of it in her hands, without putting any of it down. Not because she didn't know how to ask for help, because the particular kind of asking this required real asking, the kind that involves letting someone see the weight rather than just the holding of it had required someone specific to ask. You can put some of it down, he said. Not all of it. I know you're not that person. But some. Her eyes stayed on his. Gray as overcast sky deciding what to do. I don't know how to do that easily, I know. He held her look. We can figure it out slowly. The silence between them was the particular fullness of two people who have been circling the edges of a thing and have just found themselves standing at the center of it, without having taken a dramatic step to get there. Just there. The way things that matter often arrive without announcement through accumulation in the ordinary light of a floor at the end of a working day. She didn't say anything for a moment, neither did he. The cars around them rested. Charlotte was doing what it did at the end of a working day. Going on, continuing, Elliot, she said. He's with Dorothy tonight. How is he? He told me this morning that he's decided a hot dog is definitely a sandwich and he's prepared to debate anyone on it at any time. Kenneth watched her face. He's 9, he's fine. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a performance. The real thing. He asked me if I liked cars or just the money from cars. He told me, what did you say to him about it? I said he'd asked a good question. I told him I liked the cars. A pause. Which is true. I've always liked the actual things. The machines. She looked at the floor below them. My grandfather used to take me into the original shop on weekends when I was small. Before any of this existed, he'd let me hand him tools and tell me what everything was called and what it was for. Not in a teaching way. She paused. In the way of someone sharing something they loved. You've never talked about that at work, he said. No, she looked back at him. I've never talked about it anywhere. You can here. She looked at him across his desk in his office in her building, with the work they'd done together visible below and the work still to come logged in the files stacked to his right. And she held his gaze with the directness that had been the first thing he'd registered about her, the thing that'd been constant through every version of what the last 9 weeks had been. You're not afraid of me, she said. A finding. Something she was noting the way she noted things accurately, without embellishment. Why would I be? Most people are. Not obviously, but measurably, she said it without complaint. Just fact. I don't mean it as a compliment to myself. It's just what I've observed. You're clear, he said, and direct. And you don't perform things you don't feel. Some people find that hard to navigate. He held her gaze. I find it easy. The thing that happened in her face then was not a dramatic thing. It was small and real and more consequential for being both. The slight lowering of something she had been maintaining for a long time. Not all the way down, just enough, Kenneth, she said, quietly. Just his name. The way people see names when they mean something more specific than the name itself. Yeah, I'm glad you stopped on the side of the road. He looked at her across his desk in the quiet of the floor at the end of the day. So am I, he said. And he meant it without qualification, which was the only way he knew how to mean things. The phone call from Dorothy came on a Sunday. Not the 2 texts that meant everything was fine. The call. He picked up on the first ring. Elliot is fine, Dorothy said immediately, which was not how she usually opened, which told him everything about how conscious she was of the alarm the call itself would create. I just thought you should hear something, he exhaled. Okay. He was drawing at the table this morning. Cars, I think he always draws cars. And he was talking to himself the way he does. Pause, he said, out loud, to nobody in particular. I think Bob made a good choice. Another pause. That's all. Then he kept drawing. Kenneth sat very still. I don't know what choice he meant specifically, Dorothy said. But I thought you should know he said it. He thanked her, hung up, sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he got in his truck and drove to Dorothy's, not because anything was wrong, but because some mornings the person you want to be near is your kid and there is no more complicated reason than that. Elliot was at the kitchen table with his drawing. A garage, carefully rendered with the specific attention of someone who cared about scale. Cars arranged inside it with deliberation. One in the center larger than the others, its lines unmistakable. A Mustang fastback, midnight blue, or as close as a blue pencil allowed. Hey, Kenneth said. Elliot looked up. Hey, Bo, looked at his drawing, looked at his father. Did you eat? Not yet. Grandma made eggs. He returned to the drawing with the focused attention of someone mid-process. She made too many again, Dorothy, from the kitchen doorway with the tone of someone who had been having this conversation for 30 years. I made exactly the right amount, and you're both wrong about it. Kenneth sat at the table, looked at Elliot's drawing. At the center car, dark, elongated, a fastback silhouette rendered by a 9-year-old who had been looking at this particular shape his whole life. Is that a Mustang? Elliot examined it critically. I'm still working on the proportions. The proportions are good, they're not right yet. He erased something at the hood line. Redrew it with the eraser's ghost still visible underneath. Examined the result. What color was the real one? Midnight blue. Elliot nodded, picked up his blue pencil and continued. Kenneth watched him work. Dorothy brought eggs. The morning arranged itself around the kitchen table with the ordinary ease of people who had been sharing this space long enough that it didn't require management. Later, when Elliot was in the yard testing the structural integrity of a stick he'd found, and Dorothy was addressing the garden with her particular brand of righteous authority. Kenneth stood on the porch with coffee that was substantially better than anything available within 15 miles of Lee Automotive and thought about the shape of things. 9 weeks ago, he had been locking up a 2-bay carriage on a Friday evening. The life he had was specific and manageable, and occasionally very lonely in a way he had learned not to examine directly. And then a Mustang had been parked on the shoulder of a highway with its hood up, and a woman with grey eyes had been looking into its engine with the expression of someone who expected the problem to explain itself. He had fixed the fuel line. He had refused the money. He had driven to Dorothy's and picked up his kid and made sandwiches and gone to bed, and the thing that had started on that roadside had turned out to be this. All of this. A floor full of machines worth caring about. A team that was extending trust in the slow, genuine way that meant it would hold. A 9-year-old who drew cars with a blue pencil and said things out loud to nobody in particular that turned out to be exactly right. And Sandra Lee, who was clear and direct and did not perform things she didn't feel, and who was learning slowly and on her own terms to put some things down. His phone buzzed. A text from Sandra. The Camaro owner called. He wants to be on site for the intake assessment Tuesday. Wants to meet the team, 9 in the morning. Then morning, by the way. He looked at those last 3 words. Good morning, he typed back a pause. Then, Elliot was right, you know. About the hot dog. He put his phone in his pocket, looked out at the yard where Elliot was explaining something to the stick, at Dorothy addressing the garden, at the October morning doing its clean, precise thing with the light. He drank his coffee, let it be what it was. 3 months later the Duesenberg was done, not rushed, not forced. Done the way a thing like that earns the right to be done, when every component was exactly right and the team had verified it against the documentation 3 times, and Edward Harris had walked on a record around it twice with the expression of a man reconciling what he was seeing with what he had hoped to see and finding them identical. The owner came on a Friday afternoon, older man, unhurried, the patience of someone who had waited for a thing to be done correctly and was now standing in front of the result. He walked around the car without speaking for a full 2 minutes. Put his hand on the hood lightly, the way people touch things that have weight and history. Exactly right, he said. No adjectives. Just that the floor exhaled after he left. Not loudly, not a party or an organized moment. Just the natural release of people who had done demanding work and were acknowledging the completion of it. Brian Taylor bought coffee from the place 3 blocks over and managed to get every single order correct, which he seemed to find slightly anticlimactic, and explained to anyone who would listen that getting it right was somehow less interesting than the chaos of getting it wrong, which Edward Harris overheard and addressed with a look that ended the conversation immediately. Edward came to Kenneth's office at end of day. Stood in the doorway. That car has been in the queue since before you got here, he said. I know. I wasn't sure we were going to get it right. A pause. I didn't have enough confidence in the team structure when you arrived. Kenneth looked at him. And now, Edward considered. Now I think we have the right structure. He said it the way he said most things, without decoration, without supplementary warmth, and without anything that wasn't the accurate statement of what he'd assessed to be true. Which was, from Edward Harris. Everything, thank you, Kenneth said. Edward nodded. Left. Sandra appeared in the doorway approximately 90 seconds later. She looked at the floor below the empty bay where the Duesenberg had been, already being prepped for the next intake. The work continuing, always the work continuing. Good day, she said. Good day. She looked at him. Elliot has a school thing Thursday. He mentioned it to me. Kenneth looked at her. He mentioned it to you. He texted me. She said this, the way people say things they are working out how to feel about in real time. I didn't know he had my number. He has everyone's number. I've stopped trying to understand how. A pause. He asked if I wanted to come. Kenneth looked at her across his office. At the question inside the way she'd said it, not whether she wanted to come, but whether he was okay with her coming. Whether the category of person who came to Elliot's school things was a category she was allowed to belong to. Do you want to come? He said. She met his eyes. Yes, then come. The small real thing that happened in her face was not something she tried to manage. It was just there, and he saw it. And neither of them said anything else about it. Outside, Charlotte was doing what Charlotte did at the end of a Friday. Releasing itself from the structured form of the work week with the specific energy of a city that had earned its evenings. The floor below was winding down. The machines in those bays were at the right stage of the right project, moving toward the particular rightness that was the only outcome worth working for. I should get Elliot, Kenneth said it. Go. She stepped back from the doorway. He picked up his jacket, looked at her one more time, at the woman who ran this floor and this building and this company, who had done it alone for 7 years, and was slowly and on her own terms becoming someone who didn't. Thursday, he said. Thursday, she confirmed. He went downstairs. Out through the floor, nodded to Brian, past Edward's bench, where the man was already setting up his station for Monday morning. He walked to his truck and drove into the Friday evening motion of Charlotte. The radio was on. He didn't change the station. Let whatever was playing do what radio does on Friday drives, provide the background against which the actual thoughts of the day could arrange themselves without pressure. He pulled into Dorothy Street. Elliot was already on the porch steps with his backpack, which meant Dorothy had told him his father was close because Dorothy always knew when Kenneth was close. Elliot looked up when the truck pulled in, stood, grabbed his backpack, walked to the passenger door and got in with the efficiency of a 9-year-old who had been waiting long enough. "You're 4 minutes late," Elliot said. "Traffic. There's always traffic. That's why you leave earlier." He buckled his seatbelt. "Grandma said the same thing." "She did?" Elliot looked at him sidelong. "Is Sandra coming Thursday?" "She is." He nodded, looked forward. "Good. I invited her because I thought you wouldn't." Kenneth pulled away from the curb. "You're 9, yeah?" Elliot settled back in his seat with the satisfaction of someone who has executed a plan correctly. "But I'm right." The truck moved through the evening. The city outside was exactly what it was, full of motion and ordinary purpose. People going where they were going, doing what they were doing, continuing. Nothing spectacular about it. Everything right about it. "Yeah," Kenneth said. "You are." He drove his son home through the Charlotte evening. The radio played. The city moved around them. And that was the whole of it. And it was enough. Have you ever done something small, stopped, turned back, made a 10-minute decision that turned out to change the direction of everything that came after? Tell us about it in the comments. Because what Kenneth Harris figured out, somewhere between a busted fuel line and a restored Duesenberg, is that the best things rarely start as plans. They start as someone showing up, doing what they know how to do, and not walking away when it gets complicated. That's all. That's the whole story.